Hi everybody, I'm Ted Yacucci. Thank you so much for tuning into the channel today. Well, we've got a lot of the new docs that we've been looking at that were released in the JFK assassination. And although I'm hearing from, a lot of sources, well, we still haven't found the smoking gun document yet. Well, let me tell you, I think we found an incredible trove of materials that show us just how out of control the CIA was. And I mean really out of control. And, what it comes down to is when we look at this in total, we realize that the assassination of JFK was just one of the operations that was so out of bounds with this group that it's almost hard to conceive. Let's start with a really small one and then we'll work our way up a little bit. Let's start with the country of British Guyana. The documents confirm CIA collaboration with British intelligence, MI6, to finance and sustain labor unrest and a protracted general strike to undermine the elected government of Prime Minister Chedi Jagan. CIA Deputy Director for Plans Richard Helms reported that the agency had worked out with AFL-CIO union leader George Meany a program of CIA financial support of $435,000 to the strike under the cover of AFL-CIO contributions, and that a CIA cover representative ran the strike program. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't remember where it ever said in the 1947 CIA charter that they were allowed to funnel money through an American union to finance a strike in a foreign country. And for that matter, I don't think the union members of the AFL-CIO would be all that happy in hearing that that money was able to be funneled through their union funds. In Chile, the CIA provided Christian Democratic candidate Eduardo Frei with $750,000 in March of '64 and another $1.25 million in May of '64 to finance his campaign for the presidency against the popular Salvador Allende. Allende finally became president in 1972 and sought to expand major industries, expand education, and improve the living standards of the working class. He clashed with the right-wing parties that controlled Congress and the judiciary. On September 11, 1973, the military moved to oust Allende in a coup d'etat supported by the CIA, which initially lied about the allegations. In 2000, the CIA admitted its role in the 1970 kidnapping of a general who had refused to use the army to stop Allende's inauguration. Declassified documents released in 2023 showed that U.S. President Richard Nixon, his national security advisor Henry Kissinger, and others in the U.S. government had branded Allende a dangerous communist and were aware and supported the military's plans to overthrow Allende's democratically elected government. Following Allende's death, General Augusto Pinochet refused to return authority to civilian government, and Chile was later ruled by a government junta, ending more than 4 decades of uninterrupted democratic governance, and over 10,000 Chilean civilians were killed under the rule of Augusto Pinochet. So in Chile, we have a prime example of a democratically elected government under Salvador Allende, who was trying to change industry, trying to establish a pathway out of poverty for a lot of local Chilean people, trying to keep some of the resources of the country within Chile itself rather than flowing out of the country to overlords in the United States and other governments. Instead, what happens under Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger and the extreme right? Augusto Pinochet is placed in the presidency. He refuses even to have democratic elections, and for 4 decades, Chile runs under a military dictatorship in which at least 10,000 Chileans, and probably way more than that, are killed. All because of the decisions that the CIA, our CIA, makes. Let's move to the Congo, where the CIA reported new details on their role in the overthrow of Patrice Lumumba. They included operations through the chief advisor of the Christian trade unions, the planned attempt of a socialist politician to arrange a vote of no confidence in Lumumba, and more. What the CIA is not telling you here, and what we now know, is that against President John Kennedy's wishes, after he had just been inaugurated in 1960, just before that, days before that, the CIA arranged the kidnapping and the murder of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo. Again, like Chile, Patrice Lumumba had been a leader that was trying to establish a pathway out of poverty for the citizens, instead of having all of the natural resources of that country flow out to Belgium and the United States. Again, American industrialists led the way in making sure that Lumumba's plan would never come to fruition. Who gave the CIA, who gave Allen Dulles the right to determine life and death, to decide who lives or dies based on corporate profits? Yet, for more than a decade and a half, that's exactly what we had in the United States after Dulles took over the CIA in 1954. And we can't forget that just after the death of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, the president of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld, was in Africa investigating that murder. An unexplained explosion on his plane brought it down and killed him. The CIA was widely regarded for being responsible for his death. And also in confirmation from the new JFK documents is the CIA overthrow of the democratically elected government in Guatemala, happening the year after the Congo. And in this case, the Dulles brothers, who were both major stockholders and on the board of directors of United Fruit Company, really were the main impetus in that overthrow. They led the opposition to President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, who was trying to give poor peasants, a way to actually own property themselves and be able to work their way out of poverty. The Dulles brothers stood in their way, and President Guzman was overthrown, and that led to decades of absolute military rule of Guatemala, in which tens and tens of thousands of Guatemalans were killed. Again, how do we as Americans not look back in absolute horror at what the Dulles brothers did, at what Allen Dulles did in the name of corporate profits, rather than in protection of democratically elected governments around the world? And another example of the CIA trying to take over the internal resources of another country is in Bolivia, where the CIA had a plan to what they called rationalize, which means take over, the tin mines, a project calling for the firing of surplus tin miners and resettling them in new jobs. This is just almost unbelievable to me, that in order to try to influence the politics of another country, that our CIA would actually try to take over the industry of that country. And there's really no other reason that they're doing that except for greed. It's so that the profits from that tin mining industry flow to the resources that the CIA wants those resources to flow to, the same people who are supporting the CIA. Let's turn to Cuba now. While JFK is trying to come to a détente with the Soviet Union and with Cuba and trying to find ways to move forward in peace around the world, The CIA reveals this, that they had 108 agents in Cuba, including friendly diplomatic personnel. They had 2 illegal teams working, one of which had 200 sub-agents. They had 44 legal travelers working. They had 60 agents in Cuban shipping, and they had 31 penetrations of Cuban installations abroad. So from 1953 on, we've got a CIA who controls what Americans will read through their Operation Mockingbird, a CIA who is setting their own policy of assassinations and overthrowing democratically elected governments for their own members' monetary and ideologic purposes, a CIA conducting drug and mind control experiments on American citizens without their consent. It just can't get any worse than this. Can it?
Could you tell this committee who the individuals were involving mafia chieftains or organized crime figures?
As far as I'm aware, on that particular situation, it was William K. Harvey who was in touch with John Roselli.
It is likely that at the very moment President Kennedy was shot, a CIA officer was meeting with a Cuban agent in Paris and giving him an assassination device for use against Castro.
I believe it was a hypodermic syringe they'd given him with something called black leaf number 40 in it.
In September 1960, CIA Director Allen Dulles and his Director of Operations Richard Bissell initiated talks with 2 leading figures of the mafia, Johnny Rosselli and Sam Giancana, to assassinate Cuban President Fidel Castro. The plan was authorized by President Eisenhower. Later, other crime bosses such as Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, and Meyer Lansky became involved in the plot. The CIA offered the mafia $150,000 to kill Fidel Castro. And I can give you 10 more examples of the CIA interfering with the internal politics and the internal finances of democratically elected governments from Italy on down. But we don't even need to do that. We can just look at what they were doing in the United States, America, our own country, even though they shouldn't have been involved in internal politics. But what were they doing? They established Project MK Ultra, where they're conducting mind control experiments on American citizens without their knowledge. They have Operation Mockingbird, in which they have 3,000 journalists who are on their payroll. That's the reason with Henry Luce, that's the reason that the Zapruder film was gobbled up almost as soon as it was taken and hidden away from the American people until Jim Garrison at least brought it out in his trial of Clay Shaw. And even then, they gave Jim Garrison like a 4th generation copy. In other words, a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy down generations so that it wouldn't be very, very clear. So you have all this stuff. Then on top of that, you have the CIA hiring and working with the mafia in order to assassinate Fidel Castro, a foreign president. How out of control can you be? So again, how far is it, how much of a stretch is it for anyone to believe that this group would not have used the same modus operandi killing JFK as they had planned to kill Fidel Castro? The CIA killed President John F. Kennedy.